Good evening, everyone. My name is Ken Kozloff, and I'm the co-director of the University of Michigan Exercise and Sports Science Initiative. On behalf of the entire SE team, I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture tonight. The mission of the University of Michigan Exercise and Sports Science Initiative is to support sport and exercise-related research, education, and community at the University of Michigan. We believe it's important to translate sport and exercise research discoveries to communities of all types, ages, and abilities. I hope that you find tonight's lecture on competition recovery to be informative and helpful for any challenge that you're currently working towards or recovering from. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Dr. Alex Lemke, who will then introduce our panelists and get tonight's presentation underway. Students, if you're interested in topics like tonight's lecture, I'd like to encourage you to look at the new course that SE is offering, which will be taught by Dr. Lemke in the winter term. Applied Exercise Science 313, Topics in Human Performance, is a new 3-credit course that will be available as a general elective to all students and will introduce a variety of topics in the science and practice of improving human athletics performance. Lastly, after tonight's presentation, you'll receive a survey by email. Please take a few minutes to fill that survey out. We would love to continue to bring events like this to you, and our success depends on your feedback. Okay, without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alex Lemke as your host for this evening. Alex is the Associate Director of Education for SE and is co-director of our Michigan Performance Research Lab. Alex, take it away.
Good evening, and thank you for that introduction, Ken. On behalf of SE and the event coordinators, we sincerely thank you for your attendance for this event this evening. As a bit of background, last month we hosted Dr. Brad Wilkins on his topic of pushing the boundaries of human endurance limits that was delivered just prior to the Big Ten cross-country championship held here at Michigan. And the recording can be found on our SE website. Tonight's event is an outstanding follow-up, as we will now shift the focus to thinking about how to facilitate athlete recovery, both mentally and physically, after large competitions such as a championship. The number of registrants for this event speaks volumes to the importance of this topic and the expertise of our panelists, and we thank you for your attendance and attention this evening. This event will be recorded and posted to the SE website within the next several days. The format of this event will be 3 uninterrupted presentations from each panelist for about the first hour of the event, followed by a 20-minute question and answer sessions. We will take questions from the present audience through the Q&A function in this Zoom webinar, and I'll facilitate moderating the event after that fact. Please feel free to post questions throughout the event, but be aware that these will be held until the conclusion of all the talks. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the event this evening, Andrea Koistra. Andrea is a performance dietitian fellow celebrating her first year working for Michigan Athletics this month. She completed her bachelor's at the University of Michigan and master's at the University of Massachusetts. She is the dietitian for men's and women's track, field, and cross country, swim and dive, men's gymnastics, and water polo. Andrea enjoys mountain biking, backpacking, and racing triathlons in her free time. The title of her talk this evening is Nutrition Strategies for Optimizing Post-Competition Recovery. Welcome, Andrea, and thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for that introduction. Like she said, I am a performance dietitian. I am just coming up on my 1 year with Michigan Athletics, and I work with those 5 Olympic sports teams. In my presentation today, I will be talking about the training recovery balance, post-competition nutrition guidelines, if there's a difference between post-competition and post-practice recovery nutrition, and I'll end with some recommendations for athletes, coaches, and support staff to best optimize recovery, either for themselves or for their athletes. So for most athletes, competing at a major event is often the final stage of a long-term training program that is conducted over multiple months, but usually athletes have been training for several years. Normally, athletes and teams only make it to a major competition when they have practiced and maintained a training recovery balance throughout the duration of their entire training program. They do not and cannot practice recovery just at the beginning of their program, and they would not have made it that far if they only plan to prioritize their recovery after their final competition. The best athletes balance training and recovery throughout their entire program. There are many different recovery strategies available to athletes, and you don't have to look very hard for the next big thing that athletes will try to get a leg up on their competition. Nutrition, hydration, and sleep are often overlooked recovery strategies because they aren't new and they aren't that exciting. Many coaches and athletes want to do something extra for recovery, which is fine, but hopefully this something extra doesn't delay or replace an athlete's nutritional recovery. Nutritional recovery is the refueling and rehydrating immediately post-exercise with the goal of gaining training adaptations and preventing fatigue for the next exercise session. To enhance recovery, refueling and rehydrating immediately post-exercise is key. Athletes need to rehydrate and replenish muscle glycogen soon after their competition ends. This requires specific and timely intake of fluids, electrolytes, carbohydrates, and protein. That early intake of carbohydrate and protein is super important, especially if an athlete has multiple events or competitions in a single day. Glycogen resynthesizes at a pretty slow rate, about 5% per hour. Protein is made up of multiple amino acids that work together to build and repair the muscle tissue and can increase glycogen storage in situations where carbohydrate intake is rushed and probably isn't optimal. So what do these recommendations look like in practice? So there are two different post-competition recovery recommendations, and they depend on how much time is available between competition sessions. So we categorize these into two, whether you have less than 8 hours or more than 8 hours between sessions. So let's look at less than 8 hours between competition sessions first. So for carbohydrates, it is recommended that the athlete consumes 1 to 1.2 grams of carbohydrate for every kilogram of body weight per hour for the first 4 to 6 hours after competition. Or if you work in pounds, that's 0.45 to 0.55 grams of carbohydrate per pound of body weight. For protein, it is recommended that the athlete consumes 0.25 to 0.3 grams of protein per kilogram body weight within that first hour completing competition. And again, in pounds, that equals 0.11 to about 0.14 grams per pound of body weight. For hydration recommendations, it's actually the same, whether you have less than 8 hours or more than 8 hours between competition sessions. And that is to drink a sodium-containing fluid equivalent to 125 to 150% of the weight lost during competition. So this equates to 20 to 24 ounces for every pound of body weight loss. Now, this isn't a typical measurement that you'll take before and after competition. So it's something that you can do definitely in practice to kind of get a feeling of how much weight is lost, so that post-competition you get a pretty good average, you know how much you have to replace post-competition. Now, if an athlete has more than 8 hours between competitions, the timing of carbohydrate and protein intake gets extended from 1 hour to 2 hours, and the second feeding is about 3 to 5 hours later when a meal would likely occur. Here is an example athlete scenario who has a body weight of about 65.9 kilograms or 145 pounds. They have a competition that ended at 10 a.m. and then they have a second competition 5 hours later starting at 3 p.m. So after their 10 a.m. competition, they consumed varying amounts of carbohydrate every hour within that 1 to 1.2 gram per kilogram body weight recommendation. They actually don't get the recommended 4 hours in because they feel satisfied and refreshed. And then from 2 to 3 p.m., they're prepping for competition starting at 3 p.m. This example shows that it's not always important to use those recommendations as a reference point, and then to personalize them to athlete preferences, but then also practice them throughout the season. We all know not to try something new on race day. For protein intake, this athlete consumed 18 grams immediately after their first competition within that first hour, and then they had a little bit more an hour later, still giving them time to digest before their competition starts at 3 p.m. They ended up losing about 1 pound of body weight and replenished it with 20 ounces of fluids in the first hour and then 10 ounces in that second hour. After the second competition of the day, they had 79 grams of carbohydrate within the first 2 hours, and then 3 hours later, they had another recommended dose right before bed. Protein intake was 20 grams within the first 2 hours, and then another 20 grams right before bed. They lost a little bit more weight during their second competition, and they replenished with more fluids and sodium after that competition as well. These graphics on the bottom of the slide are simple recommendations of some are carb only, some are protein only, some are meals, some are snacks, some are a great combo of carbohydrates and protein. And they're there to help athletes and coaching and operations staff when thinking about purchasing snacks or meals for yourself or your team on competition day. So if you think about maybe an acai bowl with protein could cover your 78 grams of carbohydrate plus 18 grams of protein to have immediately after that first competition, and that would cover your 10 to 11 in both carb and protein intake. Some smaller things like jerky and applesauce could be combined to give you like the 15 grams and 30 grams. So while we don't want everyone to be super focused on the numbers, sometimes taking a few example practices just to see where you're at and compare it to what's recommended, and then working your way towards that goal throughout the course of the season, throughout the course of the year, and after different practices, and also before different practices, because you want to make sure you know how that different combination of food digests and the time it takes to digest over time. So is there a difference? And here I actually shared some screens if you're not ready to make those calculations between carb and protein for kilogram and pounds. So this one is for carbohydrates. So if you find your weight on the left here, and then you can kind of easily look for the range for 1 gram per kilogram body weight and 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight. On the second slide is another example chart. This one's for protein. So find your weight on the left here. If it's not listed, you can kind of make some, we can go back later and we can look at doing those calculations. But here's just a general range. Most people fall within 15 to 30, depending on their weight. Next, looking at the difference, there generally is no difference between post-competition and post-practice recovery. The only difference really depends on how much time an athlete or a team has between competitions. If they have more than 8 hours between competitions, then their recovery nutrition looks very similar or exactly the same as their recovery nutrition post-practice. And as mentioned before, nutrition should always be individualized by the type of competition, the recovery time between events, and of course, athlete preference. Lastly, I want to recommend some strategies for athletes, coaches, and competition staff. And I want you to remember 3 P's and an R. So practice, plan, prioritize, and refer. So practice, recovery, like I said, doesn't begin on competition day. Recovery nutrition should be practiced after every training session, as every day is an opportunity to discover what combination of foods and beverages helps an athlete recover, feel refreshed, and perform their best at their next training session. Plan, so don't rely on what may or may not be available at the hotel or competition venue, and instead bring tried and true snacks and hydration for that early intake of carbs, protein, fluids, and electrolytes. Third is prioritize, and I really encourage, if I have any athletes or any coaches who are listening, to really make that post-training nutrition easily accessible, a required team activity, and the first thing that you or your athletes do immediately after practice. Building good recovery nutrition habits together is a lot easier when the whole team is kind of doing that together. And lastly is to refer. So if you as an athlete or if you are a coach and you identify someone on your team that is consistently showing up to practice tired, sore, or fatigued, and they aren't recovering well between sessions, I highly recommend that you refer them to a sports dietitian who can create an individualized recovery plan just for them. They can also, as a sports dietitian, investigate if something else is going on that could also be affecting their recovery. So to sum it up, 1, remember that performance is best when recovery is practiced daily. 2, for optimal recovery, you need specific and early intake of fluids, electrolytes, carbs, and protein. 3, recovery nutrition strategies should be based on when the competition is, when the next competition is after that, and also individualized to an athlete's preference. And 4, practice, plan, prioritize, and refer. That's it, everyone. I appreciate you taking your time to attend this webinar, and I look forward to answering your recovery nutrition questions at the end of this webinar. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrea. That was a great talk. It is now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Lou Porciazzo. Lou currently serves as Assistant Director of Strength and Conditioning for Olympic Sports following his promotion from Head Strength and Conditioning Coach in December of 2021, having served in that capacity since August 2017. He joined the University of Michigan Olympic Sports Strength and Conditioning coaching staff as a graduate assistant in 2009 of August, while simultaneously pursuing his MS in exercise physiology from Eastern Michigan University. In December of 2011, upon completion of his graduate studies, he was promoted to Assistant Strength and Conditioning Coach for Olympic Sports. He is currently responsible for the program design and implementation for softball, women's gymnastics, and men's soccer, and formerly for women's rowing in 2009 to 2013 and field hockey from 2009 to 2015. Additionally, he serves as coordinator for the 25,000 square foot Sports Performance Center weight room. The title of his talk this evening is The Role of Periodized Strength Training in Post-Competition Recovery. Welcome, Lou, and thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen effectively. Okay. Okay, can you guys see me okay, hopefully? If you can't, somebody just throw something at me. So I appreciate the time to be here and spend with you tonight to talk about the role of periodized strength training in post-competition recovery. We just kind of, Alex just kind of chatted a little bit about me. I've been at Michigan for just over 13 and a half years or so. I've been part of several Big Ten championships and one national championship team. I was a football player about 60 pounds ago. And I spent quite a bit of time here trying to figure out what my role is as part of a high performance team that's looking to contribute to the holistic performance for our student athletes. There's a couple of pictures of me flexing with some of our student athletes and now student athlete alums because I like to have fun on my job too. So I want to talk a little bit about the expectations for today from my standpoint. I want to discuss how we'll typically categorize. I'm in a motion censored room and the light just went out, but I'm going to roll with it. I apologize. I want to talk about the expectations for today and discuss how we typically categorize and discuss recovery. I also want to reshape the concept of recovery in the context of strength and conditioning. I want to talk about some strategies and scenarios for rebounding from competition. Okay, so as we kind of think about typical recovery categories, oftentimes it's viewed in more immediate terms following exercise, and that's training and that's competition recovery. But I think about it as passive and active. And so think passive, more like compression garments, cold water immersion, whole body vibration. I'll include self-myofascial release and massage in there as well. Active typically, again, in immediate terms and in an immediate sense, is a little bit more of that low intensity aerobic exercise and general static stretching following training or competition. And so I think it's important to talk about where this falls within the context of strength and conditioning. And so when I think about passive and active modalities, I think it's really important to understand that there's no one sector or one arm of the performance team that owns any of those areas. It truly needs to be a collaborative effort amongst the high performance team. Specifically, I would incorporate certainly sports science, athletic medicine, strength and conditioning, coaching staff, and the athletes as well. So I think it's important to understand where that falls from a strength and conditioning standpoint. Although it may be physically in our space or not in our space, we certainly have a hand in that process. And so I think the incorporation of strength and conditioning itself, the practice of the strength training piece, the resistance training piece, leans more heavily towards that active recovery that we discussed. And so I often think about it as more of a chronic approach or a chronic adaptation to recovery. And so that repeated exposure to the different stimuli to elicit strength training improvements and those physiological improvements generally aids in performance and bouncing back or rebounding from training and competition. And so when I think about it in really basic and simple terms, the more physically prepared an athlete is for their sport, the less demanding the actual competition is. And so the less demanding a singular competition, the less time required to return to pre-competition level of readiness. I think about that and I try to simplify this, especially as I communicate with athletes directly and trying to get them to understand the benefits of strength training, the consistency that goes into it. And so I highlighted it and certainly put it in bold. I'd argue that recovery is a byproduct of consistency in strategic periodized training. And so in that sense, I think about longitudinal strength training being beneficial for athletes as they look to rebound or regenerate from competition and training. And I use the words rebound and regeneration to help reshape the idea of recovery, especially as it's oftentimes related or tied to those passive modalities, which they serve a place and a purpose in acute and specific settings. But I think holistically and more broadly, proper strength and power development goes a long way in helping athletes rebound or regenerate so that they can repeat their efforts, especially over the course of a competitive season. And so when we talk about periodized training, I think it's important to discuss that it's a process that incorporates a variety of factors. So one of the first ones I'll look at is somebody's training age. While that's not a chronological specific number, I think more specifically, it relates to the amount of experience they have in terms of strength training. How often have they conducted it? How serious have they taken it? How integrated has it been in part of their training leading up to the moment that you begin working with them? And so when I think about the technical proficiencies and the fundamental movements that make up a sound strength and conditioning programming, including bracing and hinging and squatting and some other upper body pressing and pulling patterns and positioning, both unilaterally and bilaterally, I like to broadly categorize them in either novice, intermediate, or advanced position. And that'll often dictate the other factors that are listed below and how I manipulate them. And that includes the frequency, which is obviously how often per week in the context of a micro sense or kind of a short-term approach. The duration, how long each session is, the exercise selection, again, going back to their training age. Is it more rudimentary and basic and fundamental in nature, or is it a little bit more advanced and progressive and incorporates some strength speed or speed strength development and a little bit more advanced protocols? I think about intensity and volume having a correlating response. And so intensity being the percentage of an established max and volume, the total amount of work. So when I think about intensity, as we start, certainly in early off-season, intensity is low and builds as volume drops off, not too dissimilar from training itself. But I think that it's an ebb and flow of that relationship and dynamic to never burn the candle from both ends. All right, so Homer Simpson makes me think, all right, now what? Well, one, I think it might be time for donuts, but that's a whole different topic. Also, I'm the funniest guy that I know, so I assume that you're all laughing right now. But seriously, what do we do next? how do we focus on consistency? How do we establish a training base that we can recover and rebound from to prepare us for competition? I think this is where it's important to really plan the work and to work that plan. And so some basic understanding of the fact that strength and conditioning is its own profession with sound professionals that should be a collaborative part of a high performance team, including sports medicine, sports science, coaching staff, again, the athlete, I would say performance nutrition, and registered dietitians. Shout out Andrea. And I think incorporating that and having an open conversation dynamic amongst that performance unit is really important. Once that plan is established, it's only a roadmap, right? It's only as good as the paper it's written on, because things happen, life happens. Training has hiccups along the way, whether it's an injury that occurs or lack of strong performance recovery modalities from a nutrition or hydration standpoint. Things happen, and so it serves as a roadmap that is meant to be followed from a general standpoint and adjusted and adapted as necessary. And ultimately, I really think it comes down to communicating effectively amongst all parties. And that's an open lane of communication, both with not only the coaches and the athlete, but amongst all those performance units, and everyone kind of putting their ego in their back pocket and to the side. And so I want to talk about a couple different scenarios that you might find yourself in. And when I think about rebounding, and I specifically have used the word rebounding a few times now, I really truly have tried to shift that thought process to more of an active approach. When I think about rebounding during a season with multiple competitions in short succession, for instance, in the collegiate sector where there's multiple competitions within a month, I think there's a couple of key points. One, find consistency. Balance the factors that we discussed earlier. Balance the training frequency and the duration, the exercise selection, understanding where their training age is and how it progresses over the course of their career. But where they are right now is the most important piece. I think it's also important to plan that more intense work, the higher intensity exercises closer to the 1 rep max that are more physically demanding and taxing on athletes furthest from your ensuing competition. And so if I compete in 2 weeks, I'm going to try to front load that 2-week period, although it might be close to the most recent competition. The most recent competition, I'm going to front load my intensity for that upcoming competition in 2 weeks on as far as I can from that ensuing competition. And then I would try to work to minimize gaps of 7 or more days between strength training bouts. We've seen that there's strength decrements that start to occur in as short as 7 days after, not to mention DOMS as a potential novel effect of that intermittent or infrequent strength and conditioning session. And then focusing on quality movement patterns through full ranges of motion. And so I think, again, to talk about strategy and conservativeness with your exercise variation to minimize fatigue and DOMS, or that delayed onset muscle soreness, I think is really important, specifically in season. There's times to vary exercise and to incorporate a strong sense of variation into an athlete's training program. But during this condensed competitive period, I would say that that's the opposite of what we're looking for. I think consistency and in some ways repetitiveness in the same movement pattern is really important to prevent that excessive DOMS accumulation. I'll talk about scenario 2. We're trying to rebound from a singular peak at the end of a competitive season. And so I think this might be the most simple. It's time to hit restart. It's the end of the competitive year. It's time to start to shift the focus towards the upcoming competitive season. It's time to take time away from rigorous training. That's not meant to say you should become a sloth. I often say just don't be a sloth during these times. Enjoy training. Get back to some things that maybe you like or maybe you haven't done in a while, and take it easy, generally speaking, without just totally sitting around for 2, 3, 4 weeks. And understanding that detraining really starts to get noticeable from a strength deficit standpoint in that 2 to 3 week period. And then I think scenario 3 is it might be the most tricky, and I think the research is fairly inconclusive in this. But when you're trying to rebound within a season that demands multiple tapers and peaks, or tapers / peaks, if you will. And so I think about the importance of preparing for 2 or 3 competitions that are all important, and understanding that qualification for ensuing competition may be based on performance in this initial postseason, if you will. In the context of collegiate athletics, maybe it's conference, regional, and national championships. It's important to perform well at each of those, but not taper or back off the exposure to strength training so much to the point where there's a detraining effect that's hard to then rebound or recover from. So again, it's a matter of finding consistency, but adjusting and adapting the total volume, the duration of sessions, the timing of those sessions, as you look to have a strong performance in those initial championship season competitions and meets, to make sure that you're prepared to withstand that upwards of 5 or 6 weeks of postseason competition that kind of ebbs and flows and cycles from competition to rebounding into the next competition. And so I say their consistency is huge, and I think I've hammered that message home pretty regularly over the last 10 minutes. But I think that intensity is key here. Drive intensity, minimize volume and fatigue accumulation, and help to maintain the strength benefits that are developed over the course of a long off-season period to stave off detraining. And so in summary, I think that as part of this holistic process, as we look to prepare athletes for competition, and the demands and the rigors that go into training and preparing to compete for championships, it's important to understand that overreaching is the objective. And we regularly look to overreach both in the strength and conditioning setting, in aerobic and anaerobic development setting, and whatever skills and traits are necessary to be successful, while balancing out the ability to repair and regenerate to a level that's higher than that pre-training level existed previously. And so it's this fine line of understanding that strength training is valuable, and the consistency and the appropriate stimuli to develop strength and power goes a long way in aiding and really helping the regeneration process, the rebound process from training session to training session, and ultimately from competition to competition. So references I refer to, you'll see Inigo Mujica is somebody that's referenced several times here. A couple thank yous, because I don't like to leave people out, especially my mom and dad, but thanks to all these people because I literally wouldn't be here without them. And then some contact info for you guys, and I appreciate you listening. I'm sorry the lights went out. I've tried to do my best to stay on track, even in the dark. I'm going to try and figure out how to get these motion sensors to kick on. Thanks for your time. Look forward to answering some questions later.
Thanks so much, Lou. Even in the darkness, you shined right through, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our third and final panelist, Dr. John Evans. John is a certified mental performance consultant and the director of mental conditioning and human performance at BLND Health. He received his bachelor's at Kalamazoo College, master's in counseling psychology at Western Michigan University, and a PhD in sports and exercise psychology from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Evans has worked with performers in all contexts to enhance performance, engagement skills, fostering environments where consistent high-level performance is the standard. He also spent 7 years working with the U.S. Army Special Operations at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he trained mental performance and human engagement skills. Today, Dr. Evans uses acceptance and commitment therapy in his work in individual athletes, athletic teams, organizational consulting, and direct supervision with master's level students studying sports social work. His title for tonight's talk is Psychological Components of Rest and Recovery for Athletes. Welcome, John, and thank you so much for talking with us this evening.
Thank you, Alex, and I am going to get that shared up here. All right. Thank you for the time. Thank all the participants for joining. Thank you, Andrea and Lou, for great presentations on the nutrition and strength and conditioning side. So I'm John. As Alex said, went to Kalamazoo College for undergrad, played soccer there for 4 years, loved every second of it. Went across the street to Western, got my master's in counseling, loved the experience, didn't love the mental health field in general. So decided to take a more strength approach to working with humans on performance and working on strengths instead of fixing weaknesses. So I went down to UNCG, and then spent 7 years working with the U.S. Army Special Operations at Fort Bragg. So talk about a group that desperately needed rest and recovery and rejected anything psychological or rest and recovery. Well, they were a hard sell, let's put it that way. So I think the first important thing to start to talk about is the barriers. What are we up against? Whether it's nutrition or the strength and conditioning piece, but I think maybe especially or to a greater degree the psychological piece of recovery is just the culture of sports. Athletes exhibit more motivation and discipline in relation to training than resting, and often appear to require more discipline to rest and recover than train. So the first and foremost, I think what we all have in front of us is just getting some buy-in, from athletes and coaches and the culture itself that, rest and recovery are not only natural parts of the sports season, but they're absolutely necessary parts of the sports season. Right. So athletes, operating within this culture feel they're falling behind if they take a break from their sports. Actually, a lot of the literature talks about between competition or even between season that motor learning and motor programs and advancing through the cognitive to integrative to autonomous phases of motor learning, actually rest and recovery periods aid that process. So these perceptions are pretty much ongoing, but they place more value on relentless effort and resilience, which can turn into a more quantity over quality approach. They also feel like they have to kind of adopt these values and kind of be in that social, have that social desirability bias in order to be a part of the organization, and they'll get kind of excluded or deny access to opportunities or resources if they don't. So the last two, really relate to something that I'll talk about near the end, and it's a way to reallocate resources anytime during the season, but especially after competition, where they really look at what do I actually value? What am I doing here? Not necessarily as much on what the goal is or what they want to accomplish or what the outcome is going to be. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But this performance narrative in sport ethic is definitely an obstacle to kind of promoting a full holistic brand of rest and recovery from competition. So what do we even mean by recovery? So a couple of examples, one looking ahead and one looking back. So Didier Drogba is a soccer player from the Ivory Coast, played a lot of his career with Chelsea. And he described in his autobiography this vacation that he took right before an upcoming season. He says, should have been idyllic, but in reality, it was the worst holiday ever because I was very tense, could only think about the forthcoming season. So my mind was in the opposite of relaxation mode. So one of the things that we'll talk about is, it has to be understood that physical rest and inactivity has nothing to do with psychological rest and recovery. The brain, and I'll say this probably 5 more times in this presentation, but the brain loves to live in the future and predicting futures and what if this and goals that and expectations that, or it loves to live in the past. And I'm going to bring up all these mistakes and all these terrible things that I've done, or things that I've, missed free throws, missed penalty kicks, bad swims, bad race times. And so the brain loves going past and future. So what we have to do really is try to figure out how we can anchor our attention more accurately in the present. So the other example is just soldiers coming back from deployment. So they call redeployment is definitely one of the biggest issues in all of their career. Is how do they deal with this idea of coming back from those deployments? And so the two things that I always heard from the guys I worked with, the Green Berets coming back, and their deployments are shorter, right? A conventional army is, year to maybe more. Special operations are maybe gone 3 to 6 months. But still, when they come back, they've got this have to keep busy, can't shut the brain off mentality. And they have also, in both of these situations, one on a vacation, one coming back from a combat zone, should have provided a ton of opportunity for rest and recovery. But potentially neither does, because even though someone can be kind of physically inactive or at rest or outside of a combat zone or on a vacation, that does not equate to that psychological rest and recovery. So what we know about this idea of physical rest and psychological recovery and rest are that coaches and parents and athletes have a pretty limited conceptual vocabulary when it comes to what those psychological aspects are, right? Not only, I've already said this once, but not only does physical rest and inactivity not really equate to psychological rest, but it actually, and I am confident that everybody on this webinar can appreciate this or think of a time in their own life, but it actually affords even more opportunity to sit and ruminate and have predictions and be at psychological unrest than when you are busy or when you are in season or when you are in a performance. So, we really have to be very deliberate about how we talk about and how we are promoting psychological rest and recovery, so that it can be combined with that physical rest and recovery. So something we also know quite a bit about is that mentally rested athletes just value and appreciate their sport. Right? They feel more motivated to engage in their sport, put more effort into it, burn out less, and honestly are at a lower propensity for injury. Right? There's a ton of relationship between attention and focus and stress and injury. So when we provide ourselves and athletes with this needed kind of mental recovery, we're doing a lot to prevent injury and kind of keep enjoyment in the sport as high as possible. So some of the key kind of psychological experiences that we're going for are, a cessation of some of the mental demands of training and competition, a reduction in thinking about one's sports, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit as well. Increased variety of activities, social and physical environments, increasing opportunities to engage in areas outside of sport. So one of the most kind of underappreciated factors of mental toughness is an athlete's ability to switch on and off their sport focus. So if we're talking between a competition, I worked with a lot of high-level swimmers, and when you're at a swim meet, you could have an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours between races. And so the old school way of thinking about this is, oh no, I got to stay focused. I got to stay in it. I got to stay focused on my race, and I got to play back the race I just had and think about the race coming up. That turns out to be not as effective, not only psychologically, but physiologically, just being able to kind of slow down some of those systems, balance out that autonomic nervous system, get that parasympathetic response kicking in. But mentally, just the idea of just continuously thinking about that competition actually has more detrimental effects than positive or beneficial effects. So then what do we do about all of this? So one of the biggest things that I'm going to talk about, and this, Augustus and his colleagues in 2022 came out with a great article in the Exercise of Sport and Exercise Psychology in Action about periodization of mindfulness training with a team or with athletes. And the part I'll skip to the end of the kind of end of competition is they really do. They recommend some formal mindfulness-based interventions. And the other great thing is like transitioning into the off season, you can transition some of these same skills, these same mindfulness skills into all sorts of other areas of your life. I don't care if that's driving, into our relationships and active listening, classroom and academic. But the idea of practicing and developing these mindfulness skills is extremely important for being able to do all of these things related to reduction in thinking about one's sport, cessation of mental demands, increasing opportunities to engage outside of sport. I think I'll pause actually and kind of backtrack. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, that's gone around a little bit about mindfulness in general. Mindfulness is simply the ability to keep your attention in the present moment in a non-judgmental way, meaning, can I stay presently focused, notice when my attention gets distracted, because it will, and then very quickly, without any kind of editorialization or judgment or trying to think my way out of it, just shift attention back to what I should be focused on. Right? That is all the other kind of glitz and glamour around mindfulness is, it is what it is, but mindfulness is really, can I keep my attention in the present in a non-judgmental way? And when I worked with special operations, that's the way I had to sell it. Attention training to anchor attention in the present. If I sold it that way, I could get them on board, because mindfulness, they just had too many other perceptions of what mindfulness was. So when we talk about this, it's again back to that, like, the mind is a time traveling machine, and it wants to live in the past, it wants to live in the future. It paints these great, wonderful imagery included predictions of how you're going to perform next season because of how you just performed in this season, or drags you back to the past to some memory. So practicing mindfulness is a huge piece to facilitating psychological rest and recovery. The next piece is cognitive diffusion. So this is something that we use within acceptance and commitment theory and techniques that really relieves people of the need to stop all negative thoughts. What cognitive diffusion really focuses on is, can I just create a little space from my thoughts, right? The expectation, and I know this from experience when playing sports, that I'm going to not talk negatively myself is almost impossible. So we don't really talk about it in those terms anymore. Like sports psychology in general, I think, and I want to think, is moving away from some of these more traditional, like, I must stop all negative thoughts, I must talk positively to myself at all times. And instead, actually, what we've found is that by doing it that way, those control and escape and change emotions and change thought strategies actually keeps that information in our working memory longer than acceptance and allowing approaches, which actually allow that information to kind of move in and out of that working memory more effectively. So cognitive diffusion just provides an opportunity to create space from our thoughts, so we can have a thought that I'm doing this presentation terribly, while my attention can detach from that and carry on with what I'm doing. You know what? Honestly, Lou did a great job of that 15 minutes ago when the lights all went out in his office, and he was able to maintain focus on what he was doing, kind of laugh it off pretty much, and carry on. Many people, like athletes, struggle with that a lot when there are environmental or internal distractions that come from between competition or after competition, and that kind of reflection and judgment and ruminating that takes place. The last one that I'm going to talk about is this idea of values. So this is not a popular statement necessarily with a lot of coaches and athletes, but it's got a lot of evidence behind it. We are over reliant on goals as a whole, as an entire, not only athletes, everybody. We, as a society, we are over reliant on goals. Goals, there is no doubt, motivate. But what goals also do, if my attention needs to be in the present moment for a performance, and my attention needs to be on the things that I control within a performance, goals are neither of those. Right? Goals exist in the future, always. And goals, a good goal, whether it's a swim time or hitting a home run or winning a national title, are some element of outside of our control. So what post-competition and post-season, what personal or team values allows me to do is to keep my attention locked in the present on what it means to be competitive. I work with a cross-country runner in Michigan who actually started to push herself. This value of competition kind of got her pushing herself too far and too hard. And what we figured out is, like, listen, part of being competitive is that your body is ready for the next race, and you are not like passing out on the ground, after the completion of the race, or not even able to finish. So part of what values allows us to do is is think through, okay, how can I behave in the present moment? I can always live my value of perseverance and dedication and courage and connection. And being able to keep attention in the present on what you control is also, very facilitative for psychological rest and recovery. So these are just some of the references that you can look into if you really want, or you can ask me about it. I think the last thing I will say is there's got to be a holistic approach to this idea of rest and recovery, that where athletic trainers and strength and conditioning and coaches and nutritionists and performance psychologists, or your athletic counseling center are included to kind of come up with, okay, how are we working together and collaborating to make this process as effective as possible. So appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And I look forward to discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, we had 3 fantastic talks. So now we are at the point of discussion and question and answer. So for those of you in the virtual audience, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A section. We've been having a couple of questions come through. So Ken and I are both going to help to facilitate the conversation and get these started. Do you want to start, Ken?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, everyone. Thanks all the speakers, and thanks for all of the attendees who are sending in your questions. Appreciate it. Maybe the first question to start with for Andrea is, a lot of your discussion suggested refueling strategies based on weights, based on body weights, through scales, through actual measurement. One of the questions I think is, how do you make such prescriptions if you have an athlete who's maybe not focused on body weight, or body weight itself might be triggering. Do you have any recommendations for sort of general refueling strategies, with or without those exact measures?
Sure. So I think in terms of that chart that I showed for carbohydrate, protein, and fluid recommendations, the only one that really looked at pre and post weight, and I kind of mentioned it's not the most ideal situation to pull out a scale right before someone leaves for a competition, right when they come back. And I work with water sports, and that's even more tough because if they jump in the water, they're going to be heavier anyway. And so there's a couple different ways that you can do at least hydration testing without using someone's weight. And I mean, you can do it every day. Every time you urinate and use the bathroom, you can look and see what color that is. And if it's really dark, then you're probably a little dehydrated. And if it's super, super dark, then you probably want to go talk to someone about that, and you definitely are dehydrated. Our goal, and kind of what I educate people on, is a light lemonade color. And if it gets too close to like an apple juice or tea, that's too dark. And that's probably our best way, and that's something you can look at every day in terms of hydration. Sometimes I do planned or surprise hydration testing, looking at urine specific gravity, and that can give us another kind of resource to tell if someone is going into practice or going into competition dehydrated or well hydrated. In terms of looking at carbohydrate and protein recommendations, most people's body weight doesn't change too drastically over the course of a season. Maybe someone fluctuates, plus or minus 5 pounds, plus or minus 7 or 8. And even with that fluctuation, if we just have an estimate as to what their weight is, then we can give general recommendations. And if we really don't have any weight at all, we can just kind of go with practice and estimate, hey, why don't you try this? We won't even talk about weight, we won't talk about grams, and just go based on, hey, here's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. See how this makes you feel. here's a smoothie, how does that make you feel? And really go based on what they report feelings to be like and how they report recovery to be. So it can be as scientific as calculating every gram, but it could also be as general and pulled back where we don't talk about any weight or any grams either.
Thanks, Andrea. That's really helpful. And maybe just sort of one follow-up question to that, sort of eating or drinking to comfort versus, bolus of ingestion. A question came up just about that specifically on post-competition hydration, and any guidelines for, whether if you're taking 16 to 20 ounces over the next hour, whether sipping is better than, gulping it down quickly. How do you monitor sort of the intake rate, and does that have any play in recovery itself?
I would just say, out of my own personal experience and knowledge, that drinking a large amount, at least say of water, of a protein shake, of anything really fast can be really tough on your stomach and just your overall feeling. If that's something that, if you're gonna down a whole water bottle at once and that's something you're comfortable with and do it often, that's great. But if you have extra electrolytes or carbohydrates or protein in that beverage, if it's a smoothie or a protein shake, I would recommend sipping on that a little bit longer than just downing it in a few seconds, just to give your stomach and whole gut as a whole to kind of get used to and absorb that as it comes. I think you'd probably get a stomach ache pretty quickly if you downed that too quickly, especially if you just came off the field. Your body is still working in a lot of other ways. And so we want to kind of, wait just a little bit and kind of adjust your GI system, get that blood flow back to the digestive system. So take your time on a few of those things and maybe sip on it over the course of an hour versus downing it in a minute or two.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is a little bit of a combination question for Lou and John, so you can kind of tag team this, but it seems like it's pretty on par with the discussions that we had about the kind of holistic athlete approach and doing that kind of combination. So the question is, how do you stop the cycle of lack of psychological rest affecting physical rest and vice versa? It feels a little bit like a chicken and the egg problem. Is it possible to disassociate the two? And if both are degrading, which one do you target first, or do you have to target both simultaneously? Like, what does that kind of conversation look like from both of your perspectives?
John, I'm happy to jump in here first. And one, I appreciate you giving me, I appreciate the little bit of shout out for the darkness there. And so I think it's an interesting question. I typically say that stress is stress. And there's no way to truly compartmentalize and separate the stress both from physically or physiologically from training, whether it's training for sport, resistance training, heck, even recovery modalities in some way are stress. And then the social stress that we incur within our life that might fall more under John's umbrella. Your body doesn't really process stress that much differently. Stress is stress. And so I think understanding how to find ways to mitigate stress with people like John and his background, and understanding that from my standpoint, if I continue to try to fit a square peg into a round hole and demand or insist that training not be adjusted or accommodated for somebody that's experiencing rather notable amount of stress, not physically, I'll say more mentally or emotionally, then I'm missing the mark. And so I think that there's this gray area in my profession that exists that we really need to have a high level of EQ and be empathetic to the people that we're working with day in and day out, and understand that as much as we want people to be machines at this level and any level, like levels at the high school level, the recreational level, at the master's level, truly at the Olympic level or the elite level, we're not machines and we can't function that way. And so I think it's a matter of empathy from people in my role, and understanding that how we can help to connect those individuals and those people with people in John's role. That's my take.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. Yeah, you're totally. I couldn't agree with you more. That stress, like if you take nothing else from Lou's psychological take, it's stress is not compartmentalizable, right? Stress is stress. And I think one of the biggest things you can do is normalize stress in pre-competition, in competition, in post-competition, and know that actually stress is what I don't think stress is and anxiety is a negative emotion. Like as a coach, if I went to a player and was like, "Hey, Susie, are you nervous before?" No, I'm not nervous at all. I might think my next question would be, "Do you care?" So, like experiencing stress is necessary. It's a necessary component of competition. And so when you say like the chicken or the egg, like I think that what I would say is you can't do both. Like you want, like the idea is like do the things that you can do to make yourself psychologically resting and recovering, to make the physical rest and recovery as effective as it possibly can be. So you're going to get real sick of me through this Q&A saying the word mindfulness and attention and focusing in the present, but that is the answer, is can you harness your attention in the present moment for as long as possible when you are resting, or when you're competing, or when you're driving, or when you're sitting in class, or when you're having a conversation with your friends and family and whoever. That is I'm already jumping to this the greatest misconceptions. Like no one is going to walk into Andrea's office and be like, "Hey, listen, I've been eating pizza for the last 3 years, but today I ate an apple and a banana and everything's good. And I've made the decision to have good nutrition." No one's going to walk into Lou's gym and be like, "Listen, man, I want to bench press 285. I want to squat this, deadlift that. And I've just made the choice, the decision that I'm going to do it." Like psychological skills, especially training your attention, that loves to be distracted, that loves to be in the past and the future, that loves social comparison and judgment. Like you're not just going to make the decision to focus better. So by practicing every day, 3, 6, 9 minutes in small periods of time to harness attention into the present moment in a way that you're able to observe the thoughts that come up, whether it's about the future, the next season, or it's about the last season and those memories, you're able to recognize that and say, "Oh, okay, I'm having this thought about the future. I'm having this thought about the past. But right now, what's important is the meal that I'm eating that's refueling my body. It's the active recovery jog I'm taking right now to rejuvenate my muscles and my body." So like you have to combine the two, where psychological rest facilitates the ability for getting the most out of the physical rest.
John, that sounds really great, and maybe there's a follow-up here, which ties into what you were saying about sort of regular practice. And one of the questions is, when is rest actually needed for athletes, and should athletes rest even if they feel mentally or physically like they don't need to? How much should the athlete trust their body or their gut versus coming into a regular routine as sort of you're describing? So more maybe discuss sort of a more proactive approach versus a very reactive approach. And this could probably have to do with nutritional feeding and refeeding as well. How much do we sort of trust how we feel, and versus developing a solid routine, and then when you deviate from that routine. Sorry, that was 2 questions maybe at once. So John, maybe to you first, in terms of how do you recommend developing this routine so that it becomes part of your your regular routine, and that it's not just reactionary to in the moment?
I mean, I think the answer is yes, have a routine, and yes, listen to your body, right? Like definitely have a routine for practicing, whether it's, listen, every athlete that I work with is going to be practicing somewhere between 6 and 8 to maybe 10 minutes every day, not in a row even, but collectively, for these to kind of apply these skills, whether it's in one context, another context, one part of sport, another part of sport. So having a routine, but you got to have a routine that's flexible. And that's one of the actually the reasons why I emphasize values over goals. Let me also back up. Goals are important. Like, we need to have goals. However, when we over focus on goals, they become rigid. Like a routine becomes a thing that I must do this way in order to win the national championship. It becomes, I have to lift in this many days a week, and I have to eat this diet in order to get to this goal. As opposed to focusing more on team, more individual values, which allows me to say, okay, I've got this value of competitiveness, I've got this value of dedication. I can focus that energy in the present, use my resources like the people here on this webinar, and develop a plan that allows me to move toward that goal without, having my attention and energy stuck there, which tends to be very rigid.
Andrea, from the nutrition perspective, so there's been a couple of questions about supplementing during competition, as well as potentially supplements for after the fact. So the question is on kind of the choose maybe for endurance sports during competition to get carbohydrates, and what the recommendations might be for kind of dosing during competition. But then in a similar vein, what can kind of supplement a diet potentially after competition, and what are some kind of concerns that athletes might have with supplementation?
Sure. So some recommendations that we have for carbohydrate intake during an event. So carbohydrates are our body's #1 source of fuel for any activity. So that's going to be primarily what you're supplementing with during an activity. And it depends on the length. So if you're just going to go out and maybe you do a 45-minute jog, maybe you do a 45-minute walk, maybe you do a 30-minute exercise session. If it's less than 45 minutes, you really don't need to supplement with anything, maybe just some water. But if it's longer than that, maybe 45 to 75-ish minutes, it's recommended that you don't really need anything, but you could have a snack, maybe some fruit snacks halfway through if necessary. It's really when competition gets to those longer time periods, so greater than 75 minutes, is kind of when we start recommending maybe some supplemental carb intake, either through fluids. So Gatorade is really popular, Powerade, fruit juice, or if you are able to stomach like chews, or you could make your own, like, I don't know, jam on bread sandwiches. Those would be really great for you. And so the recommendation is, if you're exercising for like an hour to 2.5 hours, an intake of 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour is recommended. If you're exercising for any longer than that, so maybe you have a long training session, or you have a competition that's greater than 2.5 hours, then we recommend going up to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And this isn't something you can just go out and do. I would recommend practicing this first in smaller increments, and kind of working your way up to that 30 to 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And there's something called training your gut, where you do exactly that. So maybe you go like every 7 or 8 minutes, you take a sip of Gatorade. Halfway through your workout, you eat maybe half of a sandwich, and then you continue sipping on Gatorade. And then measuring that and kind of seeing, well, how many grams of carbohydrates was that? How did I feel? Can I increase that? Should I scale it back? Did I have any GI issues? Did I feel good? Did I feel like I bonked and I need more? So really kind of taking that self-inventory is really important, and finding, what works best for you. Recommendations for one person on your team might not work for you, and vice versa. So I hope that answers the question for refueling during exercise based on the time of the exercise. And then secondarily, looking at supplements. So we mentioned like sport chews or sport blocks, sports liquids. A lot of those are considered food. But if we're talking in the realm of supplements that you take in, like, say, a pill form, like, say, you take an iron supplement, that's very different. And so if we're talking, those types of supplements, my recommendation is to find a supplement that is third-party tested, because the supplement industry is very, very unregulated. And so finding a supplement that's third-party tested for our athletes at Michigan Athletics, we recommend all of our athletes take a supplement that is NSF certified for sport. And that's just because we really truly believe that the NSF certification does the absolute best at making sure there's no banned substances in those supplements, and that they're not contaminated in any way that could harm an athlete's, I guess, reputation, as well as harm their eligibility to compete. But I also recommend kind of, reaching out to a sports dietitian to find out if supplementation is for you, and not kind of doing the old WebMD look of, hey, here's my symptoms. It looks like I need to take 10 supplements. You probably don't. And working with a sports dietitian can be really helpful in finding, okay, maybe you do need to supplement with these 2 supplements, but you don't need to full on purchase 10 supplements. So finding what works for you, working with a sports dietitian, and then I think lastly, especially since I work with a college student population, really working with, what can they afford, and do they have access to what they need? So we can't provide quite a few supplements. So I really ask them, I hear you that you want to take this supplement, but can I help you find, a food approach first? Can I help you with hydration? Can I help you and prioritizing sleep? And once all those things are, at an A+ level, then if you have the funding and you really want to purchase a supplement, I'll help you find the best one that might give you that little extra edge on top of that.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really helpful. I've got a question here for Lou. And Lou, this question is about sort of the balance between strength training and aerobic training. A runner might have 2 to 3 workouts per week. How do you plan a strength routine in relation to other strenuous aerobic workouts? Should strength training occur when there's no longer soreness from the last competition, from the last training interval? What do you recommend for your more aerobic or endurance sports in terms of periodization and working those 2 types of training together?
Yeah, so I think it's a totally valid question. I like to answer a lot of questions with "it depends," and so it really does. It depends on a variety of different factors, and so let's address some of them. And first, get out there that strength training is definitively supplementary to aerobic training for endurance athletes. I don't think I need to say that to the 77 participants left on here, but to be very clear, I understand that, and that's the elephant in the room from the strength coach, is understanding that it's supplementary, and so it needs to not only supplement but complement what it is they're doing in their training. And I think understanding what their schedule looks like. Is their training typically consistent the same days of the week? Are they college student athlete? Are they recreational? Are they elite or high level? It depends on obviously a number of different factors and what they have going on in their lives. If they work a 9 to 5 or extended hours and they're working 40+ hours a week, and they're just a high level recreational athlete, endurance athlete, then I think finding what's sustainable to for me personally, I think a fair and reasonable objective is twice a week for somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. It doesn't need to be earth-shatteringly heavy or demanding or hard, but I think consistent and progressive in nature is really the 2 most important pieces, especially if somebody isn't that elite or just sub-elite or national level competitor. And it may be even if it's a high level recreational athlete, I think that's really important. And whatever those days are, it comes secondary to their aerobic training. And so let's say it's, 90 minutes of total work to be done. And they can finish that 90 minutes with a 25 to 30 minute lift because they're already warm. So warm up's not required or necessary at that point. But that's based in some foundational movement patterns maybe as few as 4 or 5 different exercises that are done consistently and strategically over time from a loading standpoint, both a volume and intensity standpoint. And so I think when I say it depends, if you can break it up, that's great. And if you can do it on a different day or separated by 8 or 10 hours, that's awesome. If you can have your own separate day committed to strength training and then balance the second day around your aerobic training, that's great. If you work 9 to 5 and you have 3 kids at home and you have other responsibilities that go beyond training, life is life. And what's best for your situation is what you can do consistently without running yourself ragged. And so every situation is unique and dependent, but certainly it's meant to be complementary. And so if you're going to do it on a day that you are training, it has to be either second and following that run, or totally separated by a reasonable amount of recovery period in between, without sacrificing sleep as another recovery modality that's low-hanging fruit to address performance. So it's a long way to say it depends.
That's helpful, though. I feel like a big theme in the responses is that it's very individualized to the athlete, right? And that's just something to be aware of and mindful of, right? How on theme. So the next question is going to be for John. I'm going to try to combine 3 questions together. They're all a very similar theme. So here we go. So the theme is really about mentally recharging after a poor performance or suffering, maybe like going through like a loss with the time travel aspects and increasing mindfulness in the competition when you know that there's another game coming up. So kind of how to frame that for the athlete to help them kind of focus on potentially their performance in the next competition and not dwell too much in that past, as well as thinking about that pre-anxiety potentially for the next competition. So hopefully that made some sense altogether.
Yeah. So I think, and I read part of one of these questions in the chat is, you know, a subpar performance after a really great training block, like a couple of weeks of really great training. And I think this is where I go back to using air quotes when I think about things that are positive and negative. If it's not in the present moment, it's probably not valuable for your attention if you're about to perform. So even if I had this great last game, you know, I swam great my last race, I've been practicing awesome, what that can actually lead to is a too low of stress and anxiety that doesn't get the, you know, the systems that you need to be the, you know, working at the highest levels. Why we all talk about, like, we play down to the level of our competition. So, you know, when we over focus on even something that was positive from the past, then we set ourselves up to potentially just be stuck back there. Now it's going to be more common for us to be stuck on a bad performance or a mistake than it is on something positive, but to me it's no different than if my brain and my attention has got me stuck in the past on something awesome where I performed well or trained well, or something that was a mistake or a failure. So like that recognition that either way, where my attention needs to stay is in the present and what I'm doing in the here and now. So regardless of whether we're talking about, but this again goes back to attention and mindfulness. Have I trained my brain to protect and build what we call meta awareness, so that at any given time, I know where my attention is? Not only that, I need to be able to shift between a couple of attentional sub systems, right? We have an orienting system, our flashlight, right? That's going to give us in a dark room, like Lou was in, like that's going to give you like the one place I need to pay attention to, right? This is what I want to focus on. This, you know, spider in the corner. My alerting system is different. That's my floodlight. Now I've got it, like I'm not necessarily looking out for anything in particular, but my floodlight is on and my awareness is more broad. So we have, like, there has to be training, very systematic training that figures out how do I, so my clients get really sick of me showing them that this is your attentional space. It is limited, right? It is scarce. It cannot be in 2 places at once. So when we talk about paying attention, like, is one of the best phrases that we have in the English language, because it is a resource that we are dedicating to. And if we are stuck in the past, our available space is this. Now we jump to the future and judgment and emotions, and negative and unhelpful thoughts. And now we've got 12% of our attentional capacity to focus on the performance or focus on the rest and recovery, right? Whether I'm getting a massage, it would be terrible if you're stuck in your head thinking about self-consciousness or what the homework you have to do in the future, or the bad massage that you got 2 weeks ago. And when you're not present, like the actual analogy I use with my athletes is it's like getting a massage wearing a wetsuit. Like you're just not going to get what you need to be getting out of it. So the systematic practice of identifying where is my attention, then answering the question, where does it need to be and how can I get it there, is a continued practice. Now, thoughts eat up attentional space. Emotions eat up attentional space. Judgment and past and future and predictions eat up attentional space. So little by little, each one of those has to be identified and figured out, okay, how do I just normalize that I'm going to feel a little anxiety? How do I know that my brain as a thinking and negativity machine is going to shout negative things at me during a game? And how do I just recognize that, observe it, and keep attention locked in the present? And that takes a lot of practice. Like some people, developing a muscle group. People, it's 3-6 months of training a brain to stay and keep that attentional resource allocated in the present.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful. And Lou, you had no idea how much your light going out was going to be an integral part of this conversation. No, I think it's extremely helpful. The analogies that you use are really, really helpful for conceptualizing these ideas. That's great.
We're nearing the end of our webinar period, so maybe sort of one last round among everyone. You've all really described some outstanding strategies for recovery and for performance. But I do think that a lot of us will struggle to implement these moving on from here. And so if each of you could maybe leave the audience with just one suggestion to start to incorporate, Andrea, nutrition, Lou, strength, and John, some mindfulness training to our routines. Give us sort of one pearl that you would suggest that we start to implement tonight or tomorrow to really head us down this path towards greater practice of these techniques. So Andrea, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think if I didn't hear it enough from myself, I heard it often from John and Lou too, that practice is the key to success. So what you start now won't be perfect, and what you get a year from now might still not be perfect. And thinking about what is one thing that you can add to your nutrition playbook every day, and I guess start small and kind of work your way up. Not only because that's the best way to kind of build a habit, but nutritionally, I kind of mentioned it before, but you don't want to go big because that will likely put you out and give you probably some stomach pains if you go too big too fast. But I recommend, if you don't already have a nutrition recovery routine, just practice with some simple carbohydrates and simple protein immediately, kind of within that 1 to 2 hour period after every training session. And really be intentional about it, and don't kind of push it off as, oh, I'll get a meal later, or oh, I'll get a snack later, because that timing really is important. So, whether that's a protein shake with some berries and milk, and like that's what you got, or it's something you have a more complete meal with, chicken and pasta and broccoli as everyone's favorite go-to. But starting small and just finding those things of, hey, this worked really well for me, hey, this didn't work as well, and really going from there.
Thanks, Andrea. And I learned also to plan ahead and have those things ready so that you're not thinking about it and you just go straight to those recovery fuels right after. Lou, how about you? One pearl, one lesson to send everyone off with.
Yeah, I think I'll hit you with a few quick hitters. Start simple. Don't wait until tomorrow. Today's good enough. Doesn't have to happen on a Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. Monday is not the only day of the week to start something. You can start it right this second. I'll say you get what you pay for. That's not meant to say that we should all give us a ton of money, but you do. You get what you pay for. There's a lot of free resources out there that only take you so far. And there's some things that are worth paying for. If I want a tattoo done, I probably want to pay a tattoo artist a really handsome piece of cash and make sure that I get the product I want. Same with the LASIK eye surgeon and so on, right? So you get what you pay for, and tapping into professionals is I think important once you've understood the value and importance of what they bring to the table. And I'll hit you with this last little nugget. The heaviest thing in the weight room is the door handle. It's the heaviest thing to lift, but as soon as that door handle is lifted, you're in the space and you can accomplish what you set out to accomplish. You can't do it if you don't lift the door handle. It won't happen.
That's great, Lou. I love that. John, we'll leave you with the last word.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I would say it's got to incorporate all these things, like the effective competition, whether pre, post, like you have to be doing something that's systematic and holistic in nature. You can't over focus on just one. But I think just from the psychological perspective, I would say like the best thing I can tell you is relieve yourself of the expectation of constantly thinking positively about yourself and experiencing positive emotions. Like toxic positivity is a real thing. And we spend so much time figuring out how to talk positively to ourselves and how to think positively and always have experienced positive emotions. When I played soccer at Kalamazoo, like anger was my primary emotion that was like driving performance, like bar none, like period. That's a negative emotion if you poll 100 people. So like this object that we're going to somehow change whatever, how many thousands of years of human brain evolution to not tell us that there's danger and scare the crap out of us and tell us not to do it and tell us we can't do it is ridiculous. So instead, normalizing those thoughts, normalizing the anxiety and stress that comes with competition and failure and after competition and the time between competitions, and really working a more acceptance model where it's like, listen, I'm going to experience all these things. And as long as I put my attention where it needs to be and I can lock my attention into where it should be, I'm probably going to fare a lot better and probably enjoy my experience a lot more than allowing my brain to kind of really take off into the past or the future, into that judgment. So.
Perfect. These are extremely helpful clinical pearls to take home with us. And with that, I would just like to thank all of our panelists for giving these great presentations this evening and for dedicating your time to doing this Q&A session as well. We really appreciate it and made for a very great event. So thank you all for your attendance as well. And I hope you all have a great Monday evening and are inspired by all our great speakers today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Ken. Thanks, Lou. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure. Thank you, guys.